We've had a couple of AI-powered hardware devices that have been released lately. So the Rabbit AI device and the Humane AI pin. And this has become an interesting story because both of them were quite panned in the reviews. And there's particularly a guy on YouTube, Marcus Brownlee, who has a massive, massive following as a kind of tech product reviewer. And he basically successively said these are the two worst products he's ever reviewed. And that created a bit of a controversy as well. People saying, he shouldn't have done that. That's too harsh. At least they're having a go. And I thought this was a really interesting thing to see because these are both very ambitious companies. They've released these products that are seemingly not ready for prime time. And in software, we say, you should launch early and iterate. And if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your device, you've waited too long. But I wonder if the same applies to hardware. And what's your folks' analysis of this situation?
Lee, you're the newcomer, so you go first.
Sure. So as a product marketer, watching people launch products is fascinating to me. You get a little bit of that schadenfreude, you get a little bit of the opposite where you get utter delight in them doing really well. When I reflected on Rabbit versus Humane, what was interesting was the Humane tone. The AI pin felt very somber, monochromatic. The tonality was very low, almost like a deep baritone. When you were trying to think about the use cases, it felt like as if they were trying to save you from your phone. Whereas when you look at the Rabbit, it really felt very joyful, very bright. The physical hardware itself felt like a representation of exploration. And so I think there's almost going to be more tolerance for something that's attempting to try and find its way and feel like fun to use and fun to explore with the Rabbit than with the Humane pin. There's going to be less tolerance for that not being quite ready.
I was kind of coming at it from a higher level insofar as this reviewer is well regarded. He was trying the devices out as a consumer might, not as a tech optimist, early adopter, like the people who stand online for the Vision Pro. And in some ways you're like, well, that feels like a mistake if you're very early in your product cycle to be having someone review this from a very consumer perspective. Because as we all know, the combination of hardware software products takes years to refine, like a very long time to refine a complex device, especially one that's connected to the internet and an LLM and all this stuff. So to the extent that companies had a hand in saying, like, hey, we want you to review our product, just say, that's probably a mistake. That all being said, these devices get better. It's just hard when you get bad reviews in your startup and you're trying to raise money and investors see all this. So hardware for small companies, it's been said 1,000 times, is not easy. It's just not.
To me, a lot of this is about positioning the product in the market. And to your point, Emil, it's like, okay, why is this worse for hardware than for software? First of all, you're kind of stuck with the hardware you've got. Second of all, it's quite expensive. These are devices that cost in the sort of high hundreds of dollars. I think the Humane pin, at least, also required a monthly subscription. So you're asking people to pay real money for something that's not necessarily quite useful yet. And I remember back in the day, I think when Google was doing Glass, and I think this was true for a couple of other things, they were selling these things on the open market, but they were calling them developer previews. And so again, that was a positioning thing. It was saying, look, you can buy this thing, but we're not promising you'll love it. To your point, Emil, I'm not sure that this reviewer was actually asked to review the device. He may have done it off his own bat. But if you're in the market, like the beauty of capitalism, right, is it's brutal. You have to earn your sales. And if you've gone out with a product that is simply not ready, then you're not going to earn your sales. And, you're right maybe to mention the Vision Pro as well. Again, another very expensive device that is amazing and it's probably the future, but is it quite ready to use? And apparently there have been very high return rates on those things. So how should you position something like this? Because it's true, your first version might not be particularly great. And you need it out in the market to get that feedback and that iteration. But how do you make sure that people don't buy this thing and then come away really disappointed and kind of burn your reputation?
Well, I read that the Rabbit, they designed it in 10 minutes, drawing it out on a piece of paper, and that was the entire design cycle. So I think there's something to be said for taking things to consumers, getting them to play around with models, getting them to touch them, feel them. There was probably a middle ground between 10-minute back of the napkin and 5 years worth of deep, probably diminishing precision, diminishing return on research. There's somewhere in between that both of them probably could have had. In terms of how you position it, you probably got to think about who you're putting it out there for. So are you looking for a small group of highly interested, highly tolerant people who just want to play and explore and try something out? Are you looking for mass adoption? I think you've really got to be clear on what you're looking for and then be able to have an upfront conversation with the consumer. There's nothing people like than being involved in a secret club. Why we couldn't create some secret clubs to try out some really interesting hardware. I'm pretty sure, Yaniv, you'd love to be on the list for trying something out that's not quite ready yet. A few years ago, about 10 years ago, I think, I bought a good friend of mine a smartwatch, and I won't say the brand. I wrote a note in there to say, this isn't ready yet, but you'll have fun playing around, because I know that person doesn't want to play with things when they're already set and locked down. This is someone who wants to try things and see them fail and work out the edges. So if you're someone like that, I don't know why these hardware companies wouldn't try and find their community like that and bring them on the journey. And then you get a review that's full of empathy and full of wonder and full of guidance for you, versus being slammed because you probably potentially didn't have the humility to go on the journey.
One other lens for this is it's to do with how much money these companies raised. Humane raised $240 million. Rabbit raised less, but still a lot. They raised $36 million. And so straight away, they did that. And then they also did a lot of this sort of pre-announcement and hype building. My suspicion is they had so much pressure to start to deliver growth that they went broad with a product that wasn't ready to go broad. And when you think about how these sort of cult hardware things sort of start, they're usually semi-bootstrapped, maybe crowdfunded or whatever. And you can reach out to the hobbyists and you can be like, hey, we're doing this cool little gonzo thing and it's for tinkerers. Like you think about like the Raspberry Pi or something like that. They didn't do these like slick presentations and do a 6-month pre-announcement. They're like, we're for hobbyists, right? And they didn't have this massive venture capital behind them, so they could do that. But when you've raised $250 million and then you launch your hardware device, you can't just sell 500 units. And so I wonder to what extent, this is the fault of the funding structure that's simply not appropriate for this type of consumer hardware device.
It's a hard, I've been involved in so many hardware businesses. The reason why it's hard is because Apple can withstand a total failure of Vision Pro and spend a ton more R&D on it and relaunch it in a year and relaunch it in a year and take all the returns, and they just can withstand that. And so if you're a small hardware company, you're like, I better raise money because I have to withstand that. Because if you can't, then you're kind of in trouble. So I don't really know what the answer is. Maybe the answer is when you launch your device, it has to at least do one thing extraordinarily well. So your market like, hey, other things are improving, but it does this one thing extraordinarily well. Judge us on that. Not on everything else, because everything else is going to improve. So it's like setting expectations, calling it a beta, who do you sell it to, what are you saying it does, and then drawing the potential. But when you go out there and saying, hey, this is an AI pin that does everything, it's your personal agent for life, well, the expectations are going to be pretty high on that. So the money structure, I just think they need it. How else do you succeed? What other hardware product has succeeded at mass scale in the last 10 years from a startup?
Yeah, look, I think it's a fair question. I'm not sure. It's a tough game, right? But it's also maybe a question of when you raise. Like, I think, first of all, you're absolutely right. And we talk a lot on the podcast. I know Chris is probably listening to this, wishing he was here, because he talks about doing that embarrassingly narrow thing. Like, what's this one thing you do really well? Both of these devices do a bunch of stuff badly and have positioned themselves as being a sort of everything device. I think that's really bad. But I guess I feel like when you've raised that much money and then you've waited a long time to launch, and then your first launch is still not ready, you're kind of screwed, right? So the idea of venture funding is generally you raise some money, you de-risk, you learn something, then you raise more money and so on, right? And it's like, why didn't they have a version of this hardware that didn't cost $250 million to make, maybe cost $10 million, and then get some user feedback so that by the time they've raised this much money, they're on version 3 and it doesn't suck anymore. They've gone for the big bang launch and it's not ready. So it's like the worst of all possible worlds. And I think strategically they've made a bunch of mistakes in terms of just how startups operate.
Well, I think someone could have shown that piece of paper with a 10-minute drawing on it to someone and say, how does this feel? We've halved the size of the phone. We think we're going to have a tangible wheel that you can move up and down. Like, you could have walked that down the street and shown that to someone and got a sense of how it was at least going to land for them before you commit to all the hardware. And what was interesting was when they talked about, we did a design cycle in 10 minutes. There's a point of pride in that. You read like the interviews and listen, like there's actual pride in it took us 10 minutes and we feel we nailed it. Don't get me wrong, I think the design's beautiful. I think it's great to have people trying things, pushing the envelope. it's a shame that there was this leapfrogging of some really worthwhile work in between to get it really right for whatever that embarrassingly narrow use case is.
It's funny, I just wanted to join the dots backwards on Apple, which I think is maybe unfair, but interesting, right? So it's funny, in response to some of the critical tweets about this Rabbit R1 device, someone posted a photo of the Apple One, the original Apple computer, which was like made out of wood and not in a factory by someone who's not very good at woodworking. And they said something like, this thing isn't ready for prime time. And like, first of all, the Apple One was a useful device, unlike apparently the Rabbit. But the other thing about it is at the time, Apple had raised no venture capital. They only made, I think, 100 units. And that's sort of the point, right? So they could do this thing and then they could iterate. And by the time they were taking outside capital, they had a successful product. And then I was also thinking about the iPhone. Again, I don't know if this was part of Steve Jobs' master plan or if, again, it's just sort of joining the dots backwards. But the first version of the iPhone was actually the iPod, right? Again, to your point, Emil, iPod only did one thing, and it did it really well, which was play music. So by the time the iPhone came out, and remember, in the rumors before Steve Jobs' big announcement, people were calling it the iPod phone. So it's like you already had a hardware device from Apple that people understood and loved and did something really well. And then they were adding extra features to it. Now, it turns out, the iPhone was even more incredibly capable than people expected, but it was actually not the first version of the personal hardware device from Apple. And yeah, I nearly wondered if the Vision Pro deviates from that playbook, and that's part of the issue with Apple. But yeah, generally the first version of a general purpose device is going to suck.
I think we beat this topic. I think it's unknowable. Like, I have an Opal camera now and it's cool. A lot of people use it. And we had GoPros and that made a splash for a while, if you remember GoPro. And part of it is the buzz you create. So I understand why they want to produce a lot of this stuff as opposed to just doing a really small run and perfecting it forever. But I don't know. It's just a hard spot.
But they do find their people, right? Like the GoPros and divers and things like that. You can find your people who will take your hardware and help you make it better. And you find your niche and you find your spot. And hopefully these guys can do the same.
Right. So maybe the Rabbit should have said, we're helping senior citizens who don't like complexity, and we're going to do these 3 things for senior citizens. They were going to call their kids, extreme pictures, and I fell and I can't get up sensor. I don't know. And that's like your target market, just like GoPro is for divers and mountain climbers, and expand it for there. I guess I'm centering in on this, doing a small number of things well for a small, passionate community, and then go from there.
It's funny you mentioned GoPro because, yes, we'll go into the next topic in a moment. But GoPro is an interesting case of it's a product that's very successfully found its niche. It raised huge amounts of capital and got very high valuations on the assumption it could bust out of its niche, and then it never really succeeded. So it's one of those sad stories where it's a great product that people love, but commercially it's kind of a failure. And again, I think this is if you raise too much money, you raise the stakes. Just because hardware is more expensive to manufacture doesn't mean that you have got a mass market product, right? You might be in a niche and you should make sure your cap table and your economics reflect that, or else you can sort of snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And I think that's actually really quite sad for GoPro that happened.